In my vlog on Shropshire Folklore of Mary Webb, I mentioned that Mary was heavily influenced by Charlotte Burne, and a jointly authored book, Shropshire Folklore, A Sheaf of Gleanings. I actually find that A Sheaf of Gleanings is ready available both from booksellers and online. So I've decided to begin a series based from the large and detailed book. Where I can, I'll augment it with additional materials. I think I also need to apologise that it'll mostly use still photography that I can find on the internet. As from Indonesia, I cannot find relevant video clips, and I'm most unlikely to return to the UK again. Charlotte Sophie Burne, or Lottie, 1850 to 1823. Charlotte was actually born just over the border in Staffordshire at Morton Vicarage. It's said that she inherited her interest in folklore from her mother, also called Charlotte Burne, but this time Charlotte Ann Burne, 1820 to 1893. Charlotte's father, Sambrook Thomas Higgins Burne, 1822 to 1861, was born into a wealthy Staffordshire family. He matriculated at Trinity College, Oxford, in 1841, but did not take a degree. But it would seem that he was disinherited by his father. He was assisted by his brother, the Reverend Thomas Burne, whom was the perpetual curate of Morton in Staffordshire. However, the family moved to Summerhill, Edmund in Shropshire in 1854, having exhausted their welcome at the Morton Vicarage. And Lottie seems to make a big point of this, that she's finally living in Shropshire. But the truth is, all of these spaces I speak of are just running along the border of Shropshire and Staffordshire. They're very similar places, to be honest. Now, her father's said to have taken to shooting, hunting and drinking. In 1857 he was twice thrown from his horse, and as events surrounding it were somewhat taboo, it's fair to assume that he was drunk, but this led to his premature death in 1861. Lottie suffered a serious illness during her early years. Conditions of ill health and obesity would impede her physical well-being throughout her life. In 1875, Burne became friendly with Georgina Frederick Jackson, who was collecting material for a Shropshire workbook, 1879, and its companion work with the provisional title of Folklore Gleanings. Jackson's demise led Burne to take over her material, adding her own collection of tales to produce Shropshire Folklore, A Sheaf of Gleanings. This probably explains the claim that the book was jointly authored. In the 1890s, she resided at Pyburch, Eccleshall, again in Staffordshire, where she collaborated with the local folklorist and folk song collector Miss Alice Annie Keary of Stoke-on-Trent. Together they spent 3 years, around 1890 to 93, collecting material locally in North Staffordshire. While a number of joint papers were published, Burne moved to Cheltenham somewhere around 1894, and the project failed to be realised in a book form. She became the first female president of the Folklore Society, 1909 to 1911, and indeed was active in the Folklore Society for some 40 years. I mentioned before that Shrewsbury is said to be the most haunted town in England. Whether this is true, I really don't know, but it surely has a claim to be in this, as would Shropshire to be in the most haunted county. One of my listeners, Anthony Duval, whom I believe to be from North Shropshire, claims that York is the most haunted town. and I've certainly heard it said that Yorkshire is the most haunted county. But of course the old county of Yorkshire is huge and would naturally have many ghost stories. Given the influence of James I on the north of England, I somehow doubt such dubious accolades reside outside Wales or the marshes. A clergyman was walking from Rushbury to Cardington one dark winter's evening, and he heard the steps of someone running behind him. A lad of 16 or 17 overtook him and kept pace with him along the road. Not wanting to talk to the stranger, he hurried without speaking, but however fast he walked, the lad kept up with him. At last the clergyman gave up the attempt, slackened his pace and exchanged a few words with the unbidden companion. The two then walked side by side in silence for some distance. At length they reached a shed by the roadside in a field near Wall, and when safely past it, the boy mentioned a building. The clergy had gone past the building many times and many a time, in early morning and late at night, and he'd never seen anything. He did not believe there was anything to be seen, but the boy was clearly unwilling to pass the building on his own. A gruesome adventure happened to a Mr Hughes of Longnor. As he was crossing the Long Mynd in the twilight one evening on his way to visit some relations who lived on the Ratlinghope side, in a hollow on the road he met a funeral hearse and bearers and pall-bearers and crowds of people, droves of them, going as fast, and they filled the road so that he had to stand on one side to let them pass. He wondered a good deal that a funeral should take place at that hour, and that it should travel at such a pace, and when he reached his journey's end he told his friends of it, and they asked whose funeral it could be. "Funeral," they said, "there's no one dead, where did you meet it?" And he described the place. "Oh," they said, "that's no funeral. There's always something to be seen thereabout." The Priory School for Boys, which I attended, had a cottage, well, as you'll see, more like a classroom, on top of the Long Mynd, which I visited many times with the school and with St Chad's. This area is very dear to my heart. Maybe this originates with a true story, well, maybe it's a completely different one, and that's of the Rev Edmund Donald Carr, circa 1830 to 1900, who almost lost his life in the elements in 1865, and thanks to the account he wrote that same year, his ordeal was entered into local legend. The story goes that the vicar of Bloodstains had to trek 5 miles on foot to Ratlinghope to do an afternoon sermon, but disappeared as a fierce snowstorm hit the Long Mynd. The following morning he was still missing, but was found freezing but alive in the snow, temporarily blind from having lost his shoes and gloves by children from Cardinal Valley, who were out playing nearby. Now Cardinal Valley was a Victorian destination, still popular today and very well known to me. Such apparitions very often take the form of an animal. One Sunday evening of June the 11th, 1881, the mistress of a house near Condover was helping her servant finish off the work. When she was doing so, the girl for some reason went to the back door, but rushed back instantly, white, trembling and screaming out, "Miss Anne, there's a known of a dog." "What do you mean, Martha?" "The known of a dog, ma'am. The shape of a dog when the dog isn't there." "Miss Anne, don't go." The lady, however, persisted in going out, and there she saw the form of a large grey dog, which moved noiselessly around and disappeared. She could not exactly say how. Finding on inquiring that the only grey dog she knew of any of the neighbours' houses had been fastened up that evening, She herself was inclined to wonder whether it could indeed have been a spectre. You may know that I grew up in Cundover, and I don't think I recall the story of a grey dog. But I do recall the story of a grey lady, which I can find no trace of. I wonder, were these one and the same? Another place is on the road which passes Montford Church near Shrewsbury. A large dog is said to have been there at night, and once a man who was passing saw a donkey lying by the roadside. He put his foot to touch it, but it rose like a cloud and vanished. Generally, but not always, the scene of such apparitions as above is the spot where a murder has been committed, where a criminal has been gibbeted, where a suicide has been buried, or anybody who has come to an untimely end. A man who has hanged himself at Broomfield near Shrewsbury came again in the form of a large black dog. A headless black dog haunts the road between Yeaton and Baschurch, at the place where the man was murdered. A very weird story of an encounter with an animal ghost on the 21st of January 1879. A labourer was employed to take a cart of luggage from Ranton in Staffordshire to Woodcote in Shropshire, for use of a party of visitors who were going from one house to another. He was late in coming back, his horse was tired, and he could only crawl along at a foot's pace. Indeed, it was 10 o'clock at night when he arrived at the place where the high road crosses the Shropshire Union Canal. Just before he reached the canal bridge, a strange black creature with white eyes sprang out of the plantation by the roadside and alighted on the horse's back. He tried to push it off with his whip, but to his horror the whip went through the thing, and he dropped it to the ground in his fright. The poor tired horse broke into a canter and rushed onwards at full speed with the ghost clinging to its back. How the creature at length vanished the man hardly knew. His tale was told in Woodseaves a mile further on, and so effectively frightened the hearers that the man actually stayed with friends there all night rather than cross the terrible bridge which lay between him and his home. The ghost seer reached home at length, still in a state of excessive terror, and it was some days before he was able to leave his bed. So much was he prostrated by his fright. The whip was searched for the next day and found just by the place where he said he had dropped it. But now comes the curious part of the story. The adventure was natural, was much talked about in the neighbourhood. And of course there were all sorts of variations. One is that when reported to the police he was told, "Oh, that was the monkey man, sir. Has just come again at that bridge, ever since the man was drowned there in the cutty." Again, Woodseaves is somewhere I know well, not least as when at university in Stafford some of my fellow students rented a farmhouse there. The Roaring Bull of Bagbury is known in Bishop's Castle and along the Shropshire side of the border. Hissington is a parish partly in Shropshire and partly in Montgomeryshire. There is a streamlet crossed by Bagbury Bridge where the bull asked to be laid, so altogether the story may have belonged to both counties. There was a very bad man who lived at Bagbury Farm, and when he died it was said that he'd never done but two good things in his life. One was to give a waistcoat to a poor man, the other was to give a piece of bread and cheese to a poor boy. And when the man died he made a sort of confession of this. But when he was dead his ghost would not rest. And when he would get in the buildings in the shape of a bull and roar till the boards and shutters and tiles would fly off the building, and it was impossible for one to live near him. He never come until about 9 or 10 at night, and he got so rude at last that he would come about 7 or 8 at night, and he was so troublesome that they sent for 12 parsons to lay him down. The parsons came and they got under him, but they could not lay him. And he was in the shape of a bull, so they led him to St Etheldrada's church in Hissington. When they got to the church, they had all the candles. They all had candles, and one blind parson who knew him and knew what a rush he would make, he carried the candle on the top of his boot. And the bull made a great rush, and all the candles went out, all but the blind person, and he said, "You can light your candles by mine." And while they were in the church, before they laid him, the bull made such a terrible burst, it cracked the wall of the church from top to bottom. And the crack was left like that for many years. It was left on purpose for all to see. They got the bull at last down into a snuff box, and they asked him to lay under Bagbury Bridge, and every mare that passed over should lose her foal, and every woman her child. One version suggests that they could not do this, and that they laid him in the Red Sea for 1,000 years. But long after the ghost had been laid in the Red Sea, people were always frightened to go over Bagbury Bridge. In some versions, the bull would grow or shrink according to the light. Alternative version is that the Squire of Bagbury made his men work over hours, swore at them, and gave them nothing to drink. At last, one of them, in desperation, wished that he might be turned into a bull, and the wish took effect. But such a monstrous and savage bull as he did more harm than a dozen wicked men, wicked squires, and there were no churches or parsons in the county then. The people were entirely at his mercy. At length Hissington Church was rebuilt, and people resolved to try to get the parson to talk to the bull and quiet him. They assembled all round for miles and drew closer and closer until they got up to the church. The parson read text to him all the way, and he continuously grew smaller and tamer. Once inside the church, the parson began to preach, and the bull was slowly but steadily decreasing. When night came on, before the work was finished, only a small bit of candle could be found, and when it burnt out, the parson could see no longer, and was obliged to stop reading. The bull then was about the size of a dog, but as soon as the parson ceased, he began to grow again, till he was larger than before. The church was not big enough to hold him, and the walls cracked around him. The next day the parson came again, and this time they brought a good store of candles, and went on reading without interruption, till the bull was so small they could bring him up in a boot, which one of the congregation gave up for the purpose, and they buried him deep under the doorstone, where he lays to this day. There are believers in this story who affirm that were the stone to be loosened, the bull will come forth again, by many degrees worse than he was at the first, and he could never be laid again. Around the turn of the last century, it's said that some revellers were drinking one night at the inn in Churchstoke, Powys. Night drew on, and the beer began to flow more freely. One of them suggested that they go to nearby Hissington and dig up the Bagbury bull. They made their way drunkenly to the church, spades in hands, only to forcibly be turned back at the churchyard gate by the body of the Hissington men. This wilful act of desecration would have gone unleashed upon us as a terrible power that had been safely kept under control all these years. Whether or not the episode really took place depends on the extent of the rebuilding. Was the doorstep of the church lifted and replaced, giving the demon a chance to escape? If it was, then legend says the bull will grow to an enormous size and terrorise the parish once more. One would like to think that it remains undisturbed. It is believed there was an ox worshipping cult in ancient Britain before the arrival of Christianity, and that this area was populated by farming, cattle-based community. Stone circles here also testify to it being a place of some religious significance. Most of them have been destroyed, but there still exists 14 stones on nearby Mitchell's Fold, which of course itself is related to a bovine story. There was a young man who lived in service at Bagbury and was sitting up one night waiting for his master to come. Although there is the suggestion that this might have been confused with Bagley near Ellesmere, All the doors were locked and everyone was in bed when the outer door suddenly burst open and a black man came silently in and passed by the fire, passed through the kitchen and out the opposite door. The youth went and fastened the doors and sat down again by the fire, but in a few minutes the same thing happened again. The doors burst open and the black man passed through the house and into the back, in at the back door and out at the front. All through the night, as often as the lad shut the doors, the same thing happened over and over again. He never dared speak to the strange visitor, which he took to be the squire. The man was buried at Fall Lane End in Ninnell Lane, Ellesmere, with a forked stake run through his body to keep it down, and since then there's always been a frightening in the Dumby Hole close by. A man was once passing the place in a waggon with 3 horses, when he and they saw a woman with a head, at which the horses took fright and started off, overturning the waggon and pitching the man into Dumby Hole, where the waggon and the shaft horse fell upon him. The other 2 horses broke loose and galloped home, and when they arrived covered with foam, and a search being made, the dead body of the waggoner was found in the hole. Exactly 12 months afterwards his son was killed by the same horse on the same spot. The ghost in this story is of different sex from the person whose death is supposed to have caused its restlessness, and the same is the case of the ghost of Mary Way. The figure of a woman in white was supposed to haunt the spot where a murderer was buried, more probably a suicide, as murderers were hung in chains at the crossroads between about 2 miles from Wenlock on the Bridgenorth Road, which is known as Mary Way, probably from some chapel or processional route in honour of the Virgin. A Shropshire lady was living on bad terms with her aunt, who had said many unkind things to her, amounting even to slander, and had altogether done her much disservice. However, the aunt had gone to live in Paris, and they had not met for some time. The niece went to stay with some friends at Bridgenorth, and one day when they drove in the direction of Clebury North, they were nearly a mile from Bridgenorth when the horse stopped suddenly and the driver whipped it. It did not stare. He struck it more violently and it still refused to move. Miss, a spirited country girl, declared that she could manage it, and she sprang out of the carriage, took the horse by the bridle and tried to lead it on, at the same time gently striking it with the whips that she'd taken from the driver. She found herself flung aside against the fence by some power she could not understand. She felt its presence, but she saw nothing. Then a gigantic arm and hand slowly became visible, holding the poor horse by the neck in its cruel grasp, but no more of a monster form appeared. A moment later they paused in fright and horror, although the clear still air they heard the tones of the church clock at Bridgenorth strike 12. The hand slowly unclasped its fold and faded away. The enchantment was dissolved and the horse moved again, but he was never fit for work afterwards, and it wasn't long before the young lady recovered the shock, which was all the greater when she heard that her wicked aunt had died in Paris a few minutes before noon on that very day. Now this is similar to a very similar story of Powell, Prince of Dyfed. Now I've already published a vlog on the Bloody Hand of Condover Hall, but there's another story of a bloodstain not so far from Condover. The other bloodstain story is at Place Hole near Cardington, and attributed to the last owner of Place before it came into the hands of the present possessor's family. A party of clergy were assembled one Sunday night at Place playing cards. Strange how the stories from this area are always about clergy. All the doors were locked when suddenly they burst open without an apparent cause. The men locked them again, but presently they burst open a second time, and again a third. Then the old gentleman appeared in the midst of the company, and they all rose up and fled, excepting the host, whom many others basely left face to face with the enemy. No one ever saw the wretched man again, either dead or alive. Only a great stain of blood, shaped like a human form, was found on the floor of the room, and despite all their efforts, the mark could never be washed away. Ever since then, a ghostly troop of horses ride through the night at midnight with such a noise that no one can sleep. The Claton Glat on Wenlock Edge is not far from Itkin's Rock. Records another murder in its space, or glat as it's known locally, in the fence, which bounds a coppice by the side of the road along Wenlock Edge to Church Stretton. There's an ancient pathway over the steep face of the cliff into Apedale. It's said that a son murdered his father in the high road close by and dragged the body into the coppice, making up the gap in the hedge with some thorns, the better to hide. He had nothing better to hide it with. Next morning the glat was reopened and the corpse exposed, and ever after, if anyone tries to fill it up, it is opened up again during the night by the fairies. Death, however, is not the only cause for a spirit's restlessness. Worldly business often unsettled, or heirs defrauded of their due. In the autumn of 1869, a brickmaker, well known in Edgemond, died in the prime of his life, leaving a widow and a young family. He managed the brickyard at which he worked, for which its owner had bought, sold and paid wages for him, and had drawn the money due to himself for a number of bricks, pipes, etc. made in the yard at irregular intervals, so that he really did not know whether he'd received all that was due to him or not. But his firm belief was that his master owed him a large enough sum to keep his widow in comfort, and at least until their children were old enough to maintain themselves. He died without anxiety for their future. But when he was gone and his affairs looked into, it was found impossible to prove the debt, even if it had existed, which seemed doubtful. The widow and the children were reduced to poverty. Village opinion at once assumed that the dead man had been right in his belief, and that his family had been cruelly cheated by his employer. And presently it was rumoured that the brickmaker could not rest in his grave while his widows and orphans were wronged of their due, that he had been seen in the brickyard at night, and he haunted the man who had oppressed the helpless. Some years after, the owner of the brickyard died also, at a considerable age. However little he may have deserved it, he was in the eyes of the poorest folk an unjust man and an oppressor. He must therefore met the usual doom of the dishonest man. Accordingly, in very short time, it was mysteriously whispered about the village that he canna rest, he comes again. Those who come again, like our brickmaker, to punish their friends wrong, generally appear exactly as in life, unchanged in form or character. A certain well-to-do man who lived in the west of Shropshire left his property to his nephew, and a considerable fortune to his two illegitimate daughters, the childkeeper of the household. Their mother, well provided for, was at his death turned adrift by his nephew. Her daughters, however, continued to live in the old home with a cousin. A maidservant who entered the family shortly after noticed an elderly man often walking in the garden in broad daylight, dressed in old-fashioned clothes with breeches and white stockings. He never spoke and never entered the house, though he always went towards it. Asking who it was, she was coolly told, "Oh, that's only our father." No annoyance seemed to be caused by the poor old ghost, with one exception, that the clothes wore every night stripped off the bed of the two unnatural daughters. to occupy themselves after death exactly as they did in life are somewhat uncommon. The daughter of a celebrated Mrs Sidonsey was that when her parents were travelling in Wales, they stayed some days at Oswestry and lodged in a house which was very dirty and in a neglected state, which was and yet all night long there was a noise of scrubbing and moving furniture to sleep. The servants did little or no work, and they had to wake up for their mistress every night to allay her fears. The neighbours said that the person could hear had killed the old servant, hence the disturbance and the terror. The parents coming in suddenly one day heard to cry out, "Are you there, friend? Go away." Hundreds of years ago the Blounts were squires of Kinlet. You may see the figure of the last of them in his monument in Kinlet Church, kneeling beside his wife with two young children below them. One of them died from the bite of a mad dog, and the other was choked on the cord of the apple. Besides these two, Squire Blount had a daughter who grew up a woman, and a page boy fell in love with her, and when a gentleman who used to come to see her paid his visit, the boy would say that she was not at home. She too preferred the page, and at the end she was married to him, and all the property came to them after the father was dead. But old Squire Blount was very angry at the match, and did not and as might have been expected, and after his death he came again and haunted his daughter and husband and all their descendants after them, so badly that they had no peace for him. He used to inhabit a pool which is dried up now, but the site is called Blount's Pool still. Women who went to wash their clothes were often so frightened by seeing him, they came riding out of the water, and they had to pull down Kinlet Old Hall and build it again on a fresh site, for he would come into every room where they were at dinner and drive his coach and 4 white horses across the dining table. You can see the place where the old hall stood now, and the cellars are left underground to this day, full bottles of wine and spirits and hogsheads of ale and beer. But no one dared touch them for fear of angering Squire Blount's ghost. At last they got a number of parsons together and lighted candles and read till all the candles were burnt out but one, and so they quieted him and laid him at sea. There lies a bottle under his monument in Kinlet Church, and if that were broken he would come again. It's a little flat bottle, 7 or 8 inches long, with a glass stopper in it, which nobody can get out, and if the children get hold of it, the women cleaning the church will say, "Take care, as you don't want to let it fall, for if it breaks, old Blount will come after you." About the year 1820, there lived at Lizard Grange near Shifnal a very wicked man named Diggory Main, and when he died there was a great storm of wind and noises heard all over the house, and doors banging without any cause, and no one could stay in the house except one man, who bribed with as much spirits as he liked to drink to sit up in one of the lower rooms with a good fire. And the horses in the stable were so restless and excited that they had to be let out to go where they would, lest they would kick their stalls down. And this went on until the corpse had been removed, and after that many said that Farmer Main came again, for they'd met him riding on a black pony. The storm of wind and terrified horses are always the first creature to discover the presence of spirits, tell plainly whose company the dead man was supposed to have joined. The ghostly coach and horses, which every night drives down a certain 5-acre field at Frodgley, accompanied by a cold blast of wind, belongs to the same class of apparitions. Again, this is someone. There's no doubt too that the troop of horses which rides through the house, whence the Sabbath breaking card player, was spirited away by the evil one, and the phantom funeral which rushed at speed over the Long Mynd are other fragments of the old myth of the furious host. Madam Sanford of Sanford Hall in the parish of Prees, North Shropshire, is supposed to have had a dispute with some landed property which kept her from resting in her grave. She laid in a wayside pool called the Black Pool at first, when she came out and teased the waggoners' lads terribly for riding their horses when they took them down to the water. So they laid her again and threw the bottle in the Red Sea this time. And there, to make everything safe, they filled up the pool, and since then it's been seen no more. Priest is where the Raven is located, where I would travel every Friday to see Solstam. I therefore believe the pool actually to be called Sanford's Pool. Madam Piggott is called the ancient treasure of Chetwynd and Edmund. Village traditions, although I have to say unsupported by genealogical evidence, say that long time ago someone or other of the many Madam Piggotts, who having turned reigned in the old family manor at Chetwynd, was an unloved and neglected wife. When her baby was born, her husband showed no anxiety for her safety, provided his child lived, and on being told of her extreme danger, only replied that no one should lop the root, that one should lop the root and save the branch. Neither mother nor child actually survived, but after her husband had cruelly willed her death, Madam Piggott's spirit could find no rest. Night after night, exactly at 12 o'clock, she comes from a trapdoor in the roof of Chetwynd Old Rectory and wanders through the park and lanes in the direction of Edmund, turning over as she passed it a large boulder stone on the roadside between Edmund and Newport. Her favourite haunt was a steep, dark banked lane, properly called Cheney Hill, but nearly as well known as Madam Piggott's Hill. Near the top of it is a curiously twisted tree root called Madam Piggott's Armchair. The old stone wall of Chetwynd Park is where Madam Piggott used to sit on a moonshiny night, combing her baby's hair, and if some belated rider passed her, especially if they were on an errand concerning a woman in the same condition as herself, she and her black cat would spring up behind him and cling fast, notwithstanding all his efforts, till she came to running water. Then she could go no farther. At last she became so troublesome that 12 of the neighbouring clergy were summoned to lay her, but incessantly reading psalms till they made her obedient to their power. Mr Foy, a curate of Edmund, had the credit of having been the one to succeed in this, for he continued to read after all the others were exhausted. Some 10 or 12 years after his death, some fresh alarm of Madam Piggott arose. In the middle of a freezing winter, Mr Foy had died, and a child skating on Chetwynd Pool broke the ice and saw a glass bottle floating just beneath the surface of the water. The party went with haste to beg a neighbouring rector to come and lay the ghost. The second time it was captured, it was buried in Newport Cemetery beneath the chapel, never to be disturbed again. Chetwynd Hall has the reputation for being haunted, and many shrink from facing Madam Piggott's Hill after death, although modern sightings have placed Madam Piggott as in the passenger seat of cars on the A41 from Newport to Market Drayton. The Church of Stanton upon Hineheath, there is a loose brass plate in the vestry which recorded the fact that Elizabeth Brown, daughter of Jonathan Brown of Sobath, died January the 6th, 1777, aged 72. She was supposedly first buried in the dingle adjoining her father's house, but she came again, so they were forced to take her up and bury her in the church. She used to sit on a large stone awaiting unwary passers-by, and mount up behind boys when they took their horses to water, till at last they got all the parsons in the county together, who prayed her unquiet spirit into a bottle, which was buried in the nave of the church. On laying down on encaustic tiles instead of old flags, the workmen were advised to search the tomb for the bottle, but they did not dare to do so. Much fear is expressed in the parish lest the ghost should take to annoying the waggoners' lads on dark evenings. Roberts at Church Stretton in 1881 declared that he'd seen the ghost of a woman named Sarah Duckett, who had not been seen or heard of for several years, walking near the old Hazelgate toll bar, but disappearing close to a disused mining shaft known as the Copper Hole. Others began to say that they too had seen the apparition. It was supposedly that of the woman who'd been murdered at the turnpike, where she was known to have stayed, and the body thrown down the Copper Hole. A sum of money was collected to defray the cost of clearing out and exposing the old shaft. It was night time, and a weary traveller arrives at Church Stretton station. She was carrying two tired-looking boxes, one of them broken around the lock, and she placed them on the ground. She inquired about the train times as walked off. A few locals spot her, and she's a familiar face, but one that's been away for some time. They watched as she strolled up the bank to Hasler Road. This was the last time she was ever seen alive. She was Sarah Duckett, apparently the same apparition that William Roberts had seen. A party of men were sent to work. A number of people of all classes came to visit the spot. Letters headed the Shropshire Mystery appeared almost daily in London papers, describing the progress of the work. At length the bottom of Copper Hole was reached, and there nothing was found. Nevertheless, the site became something of a tourist attraction. The Reverend Holland Sanford knew Sarah Duckett and her family very well. He saw it his duty to clear up the matter and began to investigate. He spoke to her relatives, who told him they'd heard of her whereabouts was 7 years ago, when she was in a workhouse in Worcester. It soon afterwards proved that the missing woman had died in hospital at Worcester some years before. It would seem that Sarah had indeed visited the station at Church Stretton, having returned from Australia, but then went to Worcester. Now, Church Stretton's a beautiful town where the Cardinal Valley starts, and it's where my parents would take me on summer's evenings to play pitch and putt.